Without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker of the morning. He comes from our Hermiston Research and Extension Center, Scott Lukas. He's brand new, just a couple of years on the job, and already he's doing a lot of great work for all of you guys. And today he's going to be talking about common pests and diseases in Columbia Basin watermelon. Scott.
All right, well, it's great to be here, getting you guys started for the first presentation of the day. So as Sylvia said, I'm at the Herrick Station down the road with OSU, and just came on a couple of years ago. I don't know what time frame constitutes brand new or not, but I still feel new regardless. I guess till someone newer comes to replace me, then that's when I'm not new anymore. So as Sylvia said, I'm going to be talking about some common pests and diseases in watermelon. But before we get started, just go a little background into watermelon, some of the historical aspects of it. Watermelon is Trillus lanatus, and this was originally out of northeastern Africa. And some of the evidence from this is found in Libya. The seeds were found about 5,000 years ago. And then about 4,000 years ago, over to the west in Egypt, there were seeds found, and there are paintings on the pharaoh tombs and sketches of the pharaoh tombs of watermelon. And what was interesting in some of these depictions is that the fruit they were seeing on the wall, which was identified by archaeologists as watermelon, were oblong. And the wild type natural fruit originally was round. So this is an indication that 4,000 years ago they were cultivating watermelon. However, this was extremely bitter fruit and was not really edible, or reports were not likely edible. So they would use watermelon as a vessel for water. And so they could store it far into the season, squish it or extract the water, and then use that for drinking. There were remnants of watermelons in some of the pharaoh's tomb. King Tut, we'll just say that. And that was thought to provide water into the long journey into the pharaoh's afterlife. So fast forwarding about 4,000 years, there were reports of Greek scholars as it arrived in the Mediterranean region that were praising watermelon for its healing properties, of which we still know a lot of great properties medicinally from melons today. Then moving forward a bit more, the first Hebrew text about watermelons was placing it in the same group as pomegranates, figs, and grapes. So, any idea of what the significance of in that grouping might be? We might have a door prize here if someone wants to guess.
Wine.
Okay, wine. And wine is generally on the sweeter side. So this was the first report of watermelons being sweet, showing that the cultivation moved from bitter into the sweet side. And you said wine back there, so. So moving to nowadays, about 2017, currently the production of watermelon in the U.S. is around 113,000 acres, bringing in about 40 million pounds, resulting in about a $5 million value. This is a 2017 estimate, likely pretty similar in 2018. The majority of the melons in the U.S. are coming from 4 states, Texas being producing the highest, Florida, Georgia, and then California respectively. About 76% of the melons that we consume are produced here in the U.S., with only about a quarter of that coming from import markets. So a little closer to home, in the Columbia Basin, we are producing, on the Oregon side, about 1,200 acres, and this is just watermelon. If we're looking at melons in general with cantaloupes, we're maybe more around 1,600 acres. And across the border on the Washington side, it's about 650 acres of melons. And a lot of these are more for the specialty melons, which aren't necessarily going to be exported. But despite the small acreage in this area, we have very well-known fruit, the iconic fruit, essentially a branded Hermiston melon. And so these are shipped extensively throughout the Pacific Northwest, and there's been some of the growers send them as far as Maryland. So for a small region, we're shipping melons a pretty large distance. So any ideas why the melons are so sweet and so special here? This is because, of course, the best growers. But secondly, there's some physiological processes that are contributing to this as well, especially the hot days and cold nights. In a lot of the other production regions, the nighttime temperatures don't drop as low as they do here. So when the plant is creating its starches, or the carbohydrates, excuse me, all day long through the process of photosynthesis, it is storing these carbs, which are essentially sugars, for use at nighttime. So the hotter the nighttime temperature, the more the plant, the watermelon, is metabolizing and drawing off those stores. But when the temperatures are cooler at nighttime, it's not using as much of those stores, so it's resulting in a net accumulation of the carbs, which causes a sweeter fruit. So that's why we have the sweetest watermelons in the country. So since we're not talking about background of watermelon, we're talking about pests in this session, something to always be conscious of whenever we're thinking of pest management is integrating strategies and using an integrative pest management approach. So throughout the talk, we'll come back to some of these aspects, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with them, but whenever you're trying to maximize your control, you want to be looking at aspects of cultural control, biological, chemically, and mechanically. So try to, instead of just focusing on hitting with chemical, try to be looking at a holistic approach, and you'll just end up doing a much better job. So we'll move on to some of the challenges we have in production. I'll be mainly focusing on insects, a little bit about weeds, and then some pathogens. So first off, ants. Ants aren't generally seen as a pest to a lot of these crops, but in my experience, ants have caused significant damage to my melons. And this is usually only right after transplanting, when the stems are really soft and fragile. The ants will get in and they'll essentially just chop off the transplants. So it's important to get out there and scout really quickly, and if you see plants that are wilting or starting to fall over, then this is likely an indication that there's ants. You can, they spread rapidly, so if you do notice this, try to get on it quickly because they get out of control and they cause significant damage. Although it's pretty close, they hit the transplants, it's fairly close to, you could replant, but even if it's a week or 2 weeks later, then that's going to cause a difference in harvest timing. So uneven planting causes some challenges. With the control, as I said, catch them early, treat around the hot spots. It's not necessary to treat the entire field, but treat around the areas where you're seeing the presence of ants. They're easy to see, we all know what they look like. This can be achieved by putting bait stations, just like some of the bait stations you have around your house. You could put those directly in the planting hole under the plastic, or you could sprinkle the bait in the hole. The bait stations, I feel, are a little more effective because they're not saturated by the water as much. There are some products that say you could inject it through the drip. I've used a couple of these and fairly low efficacy. So my best option would be to go for the bait stations. If you're looking at more organic approaches, you can use diatomaceous earth, and that's it's good for knocking down the population, but they don't take that back to the nest like the bait stations. So if you want to come at it from both approaches with the bait station and the diatomaceous earth, it takes down the population pretty quickly. There's also some organic insecticides, the spinocides, and those can be applied at 0.03 pounds per acre. Aphids, how about when you go to each of these pests, if you guys, any of you grow melons out here? Okay, so we won't ask if you have these pests on your melons because you don't have your melons. So with aphids, fairly common, not a huge issue. They can persist all season. Some of the aphids that are most damaging to melons are knocked down by the heat. So in the heat of the season, a lot of times we'll see the populations dip. There's been some reports of the higher nitrogen usage causing greater aphid populations. So again, a good reason to keep a fertilization program on track and not be, among other reasons, not be putting excess nitrogen. Some of the damage is fairly apparent. The aphids usually hang out underneath the leaf, and in really high populations, we'll see wilting and the leaves curling downwards. There's a number of control methods since aphids are a very, very common agricultural pest. So there's a number of different methods of chemical control and biological control. Whenever we're treating watermelons, if you are spraying some kind of chemical application, or I guess a lot of plants in general, it's best to have the foliage dry. Wet foliage will tend to cause more injury. Armyworm and cutworm. This isn't a very big challenge out here, but I put it in anyways. There are a few different types, the beet, Bertha, and western armyworm, and then the black and variegated cutworm. Start as the larval stage, which are fairly large, about 1.5 inches, and then metamorphosize into the moth. The larvae are the ones that cause the damage. The cutworm, or the armyworm, will feed generally on the leaves and the buds. However, there have been some reports of actually gnawing on the fruit, as we see here. I haven't seen that, but happened somewhere, since there's a picture of it. And the cutworm will generally go for the stems. So similar to the ants, they'll just kind of lop off the stem, and then you'll see a wilted plant. Weed control is important for this because lamb's quarter is a well-known host for the females in attracting and laying their eggs. So keeping your weeds controlled within the rows will do a great job and do a good service in trying to keep the populations down. There are some options. The Thrin pesticides, bifenthrin, permethrin, those are pretty effective, as well as Seduce on the organic side. Moving on to wireworm. This is increasing in populations. I'm not too sure if it's going to be a huge challenge in melons. It is most challenged in some of the crops with tubers, Irish potatoes, or sweet potatoes in the storage roots. Wireworms are the larvae of the click beetle, and they're underground and they burrow into the tubers. In the case of a melon, since we're not eating tubers, they will attack the roots often. So, not as easy to see the damage. Sometimes in high populations you'll see wilting plants, but for the most part you won't notice a whole lot of damage until they really do a number on the root system. So as you see in this example, clearly not melons, but wireworms almost eliminated the root system on this romaine. There have been some reports of the wireworms getting into the melons, the actual fruit, on the ground patch. I haven't seen that, but it makes sense that they would because it's contacting the soil surface. If you are worried about wireworms, or you think you're coming from a field where maybe there were sweet potatoes in the past or potatoes, you can do preliminary trapping to get an estimate of some of your populations. Sylvia created an extension publication that's available here at the Oregon State Extension. If you just Google Sylvia Rondin wireworm trap, you'll get this great extension publication that you could get more information. Essentially, it is the quick and dirty method here. I'm not going to explain all the steps. It's a small planter pot with vermiculite, some seeds, and more vermiculite, and you put it in the soil, and that CO2 emission will attract the wireworms. In terms of control, we could use some fumigants and the bifenthrin or ivermectin, that combination. However, when controlling these, it's important to be aware of the life cycle, because we see in the beetles are in their adult stage, January, April, then they're laying their eggs, this is egg deposition, around May through August, which the larva then hatches and creates a cycle again. So if we're going to be doing any type of control, we want to be trying to get the larva, and so we're looking at this smaller window between June through August. So sometimes that's a challenge because on the fumigation, a lot of times with the melon and the black plastic, you need to have a 30-day interval before planting. So you want to try to get that on as close as you can as this window, so it's going to be effective on the larval stage. Other common pests, which I'm not going to go much into detail for the insects, are thrips and spider mites. a huge range of control options for these. Generally, these are damaging because they're vectors of other pathogens. Mites are usually not a challenge in watermelon production. Usually we'll see more mites coming up if there's a broad spectrum insecticide applied beforehand, so it knocks off some of the predatory mite population balances, and then we see a surge of the undesirable mites, such as the spider mites. Rodents, on the other hand, is something I know we have here and cause a lot of damage. They can gnaw on the fruit, as you see in these illustrations, but more problematic is they go under the plastic mulch and they eat the drip lines. And this is a very time-intensive process because you have to, one, determine there's a leak, then you have to cut the plastic mulch, go in, repair the drip line, and then flush the system afterwards. So when you get interns that successfully trap the rodents, they have big smiles on their faces because she was very happy at this catch. She did a lot of irrigation repair to come to this point. So you can trap them all season. In the fall, we generally see a little more presence and activity. So trapping in the fall is also a good option. And you could also put out bait traps as well. So moving on into the diseases, we have Alternaria. I'm going to try to hurry up because my time is ticking. Generally, this is spread through wind and water splashing. It survives year by year, so it can persist for a long time in the environment. Generally, we're going to see this type of symptoms on the older leaves closest to the crown. And it's going to start with a small yellow halo with a small necrotic patch, a dead patch in between. And then that's going to radiate outwards as the disease persists. It can get in severe situations. You can see a lot more necrotic regions like we see in the illustration below. On the fruit, there's reports of it being dried on the surface, but real spongy and moist on the inside. And this would be an extremely infected plant in order to have that type of damage translocating into the fruit. So some of the cultural control methods would be the plastic mulch, which all the growers out here are basically doing, and the drip irrigation, because we're eliminating the water coming from above. As well as some other chemical options, the mancocide, 3 pounds per acre, Quadris Flow, effective, and actinovate if we're looking for the organic side. Fusarium is probably one of the most challenging pests that we see in the Columbia Basin, and actually a lot of watermelon around the U.S. Fusarium is continually a challenge. This is abundant worldwide. There are a huge variety of different genus or species of Fusarium. The nivium is which causes the damage, the pathogenic to watermelons. There are both pathogenic and non-pathogenic, so some of the Fusarium aren't an issue to our crops. I've been trying to do some studies with Fusarium, and we had very low pressure in the field at the ag station, and I tried to inoculate the soil, and I tried to grow the Fusarium, and I just was not able to get it to grow out there. So of course, where you want it, you don't have it, but where you don't want it, you have it. So some of the symptoms here, the Fusarium it's a soil-borne pathogen, and it will get into the plant stem, these translocating tissues in the xylem specifically, and it will cause this browning. And what that is, it essentially is clogging the xylem, so the plant is not able to bring water through the growing tissues, and you'll see a wilting plant like this. It may only be on one of the vines, but still it's moving through the rest of the vascular tissue. So some of the control methods, well, if you think you're coming into a place with Fusarium, which is very likely you are, do some soil tests before you go into that field and determine if you need to be trying to come at it with a control. There are some fumigation options you can use, as well as resistant varieties, although the resistant varieties around here really aren't that resistant. So fumigation is a good option. There's some experiments going on with trying to come in with a post product, like a peroxide, and running that through the drip to maybe get some of the populations down, which is looking like it might be effective, as well as grafting for the resistance. Verticillium is also up there with Fusarium. Sometimes they act in concert with each other. Verticillium wilt has very similar symptoms as the fusarium wilt. Again, it's a soil-borne fungus. The only difference with fusarium in terms of its, or verticillium in terms of its presentation is the yellowing area you'll see sometimes on the leaf. Whereas fusarium, it's hard to determine what it is if you're not actually cutting open the stem and looking at that vascular tissue. So both with fusarium and vert, we see this generally more in over-irrigated areas. So being on track of your irrigation program, especially if you're using drip, automating that where you're looking at the soil moisture values, is really going to do you favors in terms of reducing this disease pressure. Again, just like fusarium, do a pre-soil test. Avoid some crops that are extremely susceptible, such as potato, tomato, or mince. You can fumigate if you have your soil tests are showing that it's worth putting the efforts into control if you think your values are at a threshold, as well as grafting. There's a lot of grafting going for resistance now up in Washington. Dr. Carol Miles has a pretty extensive grafting program, and we're going to be bringing some of those varieties down here this year to test how they perform in this part of the basin. So you see some of the work with the grafting. In the same field, the same day, this is a non-grafted watermelon plant. You see the wilt is heavily affecting it. Generally, we see most of the presentation of the symptoms when the fruiting stress is on, because of course as we're developing these fruit in the later stages, it's usually hotter, and two, the plant is under stress because it's working on developing these fruit. So it's really important that it's translocating properly. So that's when we see the damage express itself mostly. And then next to it we have a grafted watermelon, which is completely healthy, same disease pressure. If you look at this figure here, we see these two upper lines are the non-grafted and then grafted to itself, so we know that the grafted is the effect of this. And then the two bottom, so we see about 45% incidence later in the season, and the grafted varieties are less than 5% incidence of the verticillium. So grafting is extremely effective. Some other diseases is damping off. This is not that much of a challenge if you are using transplants. However, if you're growing your own transplants, then this is likely to occur. Generally, you could get away from this by doing a seed treatment. And I think only a couple of the growers here are actually growing their own transplants. They're generally companies that they just buy the transplants and put them in from there. But if you are doing it, try to get a seed with a seed treatment. Come at this before you do the planting, before you're making your transplants. You can use some Iridomil spray or a soil drench generally are appropriate. But if you wait until you see the damping off symptoms, it's likely going to be too late. It spreads extremely quickly. You start with a wetting right at that soil surface where it looks like a saturation, and then within a day or two, it moves up, causing the plant to break down and die. Downy mildew, this seems to be sporadic. There was a pretty bad infestation in this area in 2009. Again, there were some reports mainly in Washington in 2017. This again is windblown, as with many of the other diseases we spoke about, the fungal. High humidity tends to exaggerate the challenge or exaggerate the issue. So again, using the drip is a good cultural method to try to bring this down. Some of the symptoms we see on the top, we see angular lesions, necrotic lesions on the leaf. Then if you flip it over, this is really easy to identify because we have these kind of fluffy, grayish, purple growths. It's like a woolly growth on the bottom of the leaf. So this again is pretty easy to identify. There are a number of control. Phosphonates are somewhat effective, but you could come at it with the copper. There's some organic copper products that do a good job of control, as well as some of the other organics, the actinolate and serenate also. So again, getting on this early is the way to go. Try to stay out of the fields if they're wet with all of these or most of these diseases. Staying out of the field if the leaves are wet, because that's really going to be a mode of spreading. Powdery mildew, again, I think we all know what this is. This Essentially looks like baby powder sprinkled on the leaves. Again, usually doesn't cause a big issue, but when the populations get high enough, it could cause stunting and distortion of the plants. So control on this is generally the best with your oils. Some of your organic oils such as the neem, safety side, or erase are generally effective, as well as wettable sulfur and some of your copper products as well. I don't think it's necessary to come in with the fungicides on powdery mildew. I would say approach it from the less toxic side first, some of the organic oils. And however, plastic mulch is definitely necessary for weed control, for a lot of these other pathogen controls, as I mentioned. So on the weed control side, when you have your plastic mulch and the watermelons are on it here, you want to come in and clean up the rows before they start binding into the rows. So come in and clean those rows, do your weeding. If you're going to do a chemical application, this is the time, not when they start binding out, because you want to be keeping that spray off of the plants. Use low pressure nozzles, spray when appropriate times, not when it's windy, of course, not when it's super dry, because then you get a lot of that volatilization. Air induction nozzles are a good way to keep your drift down. Essentially, this makes a more coarse droplet. You see some of the illustrations of using a typical nozzle. You see how much drift is coming off of this, and this is just 5 miles an hour wind, so very common wind in this area. And you see how much drift damage results as a factor of that drift. Whereas air induction, not much drift you see, and a very clean line. So if you're going to be coming in next to the rows using a post-emergent product as you would be, you want to use a lower pressure or a nozzle that's designed to reduce drift. So in conclusion, a lot of these diseases are straightforward and the pests are straightforward. Any concern or question, bring them into the station. We have a great pathologist here. We have a lot of folks at the station who are entomologists in different disciplines, so we could help with your identification. So don't hesitate to bring any leaf or insect in for ID. Make sure you're out scouting the fields, looking for the problem, and act quickly if you do see anything. Rotate your mode of action, follow the label, of course, and consult the Pacific Northwest Pest Management Guidelines for a lot of these diseases and pictures and control methods. So with that, I'll open up. I know I ate into some of the question time. We have probably a couple minutes left.